The prefabricated shelters of Epsilon 7 hummed with the constant thrum of atmospheric processors, a mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack of displacement for 3,000 Kithaeron refugees. Lyreley pressed her palms against her elongated ears, trying to muffle the sound that seemed to vibrate through her skull, but it was useless. The processors were necessary. Without them, the moon's thin atmosphere would kill them all within hours, but they reminded her constantly that this place was not home. Her son's cries cut through the mechanical drone like a plasma cutter through hull plating. Zephyr lay in his biopod, a sleek Kithaeron cradle that monitored every breath, every heartbeat, every neural fluctuation, and still couldn't tell her why he wouldn't stop crying. The pod's holographic display showed optimal conditions. Temperature regulated to Kithaeron standards, atmospheric composition perfect. Even the ambient light spectrum adjusted to mimic the golden hues of Cathara Prime's twin suns. "Everything is normal," the pod's AI announced in its maddeningly calm voice. "Infant vitals within acceptable parameters, nutritional requirements met, environmental conditions optimal." Lyreley wanted to kick the damn thing. "If everything is normal, why won't he sleep?" she muttered, her ears flicking with irritation. The gesture was involuntary, a evolutionary remnant from when her people's ancestors needed to track predators by sound alone. Now it just made her feel more alien among the humans who watched her with barely concealed curiosity. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the transport ships had deposited them on this desolate rock, and Zephyr hadn't slept for more than an hour at a time. The other refugees had stopped offering advice after the second week, when it became clear that traditional Kithaeron methods, harmonic resonance therapy, pheromone adjustment, even the ancient blood songs her grandmother had taught her, had no effect. They whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices carrying easily to her sensitive ears. "War touched," old Vexen had said yesterday, shaking his grizzled head. "The child absorbed too much conflict energy in the womb. It happens sometimes." War touched, as if her son was a broken piece of equipment rather than a living being. Lyreley had wanted to point out that Vexen's own grandson seemed perfectly fine despite being born during the siege of New Thessaly, but she'd held her tongue. Arguing with fellow refugees was the last thing she needed. A knock on her shelter's aluminum frame made her ears perk up. "Food distribution," came a gruff human voice. Sergeant Tors, she'd learned, though she wasn't sure if that was his first name or last. Human naming conventions still confused her, another reminder of how little her xenobiology degree had prepared her for actual interaction with the species she'd spent years studying. She opened the door to find Tors holding a standard-issue nutrition pack, his expression as neutral as always. The man was built like a siege engine, all broad shoulders and mechanical efficiency, and he distributed supplies with the same methodical precision that had probably made him effective at killing her people during the war. "Thank you," she said in careful English, accepting the pack. The plastic felt cheap compared to the biodegradable containers her people used, but she'd learned not to comment on human environmental practices. Tors nodded and started to turn away, then paused. "Kid still keeping everyone awake?" he asked, not unkindly. Lyreley's ears drooped. "I'm sorry, I know the noise." "Not complaining," Tors interrupted. "Just, maybe you should talk to the docs again. Human ones this time, different perspective might help." The suggestion hung between them like a diplomatic proposal, neither quite trusted. Lyreley had avoided the human medical staff partly from pride and partly from fear. What if they discovered something wrong with Zephyr that Kithaeron healers had missed? What if they wanted to study him like a specimen? Her people had enough experience with human curiosity during the war. Tors seemed to read her hesitation. "Doc Ewan's good people. Delivered half the human babies on Kepler Station before the war. Knows kids." Before Lyreley could respond, Zephyr's cries reached a new crescendo that made even Tors wince. The sergeant's presence seemed to agitate the infant further, which made no sense. Zephyr couldn't possibly understand the significance of human military uniforms at his age. "I'll consider it," Lyreley said finally. Tors nodded and continued his rounds, leaving her standing in the doorway with a nutrition pack and a crying child. She watched him move from shelter to shelter with practiced efficiency, noting how other refugee children seemed to quiet when he approached. Only her son reacted with increased distress. Inside, Zephyr's biopod was displaying what the Kithaerons called cascade distress patterns. Elevated stress hormones, irregular neural activity, and breathing patterns that suggested something approaching panic. Lyrale had seen similar readings in adult refugees suffering from what humans called post-traumatic stress. But that diagnosis seemed impossible for an infant who had no conscious memories of the war. She activated the pod's communication system and requested a priority consultation with the Kitharan Healing Circle. While she waited, she tried singing the old lullabies again, her voice harmonizing with frequencies that should have triggered instinctive comfort responses. Zephyr's cries only grew louder. "Perhaps," came a familiar voice from behind her, "it's time to admit our methods aren't working." Lyrale turned to find healer Zerk standing in her doorway, his own ears angled with concern. Unlike most Kitharans, Zerk had volunteered to work with human medical staff since their arrival, an arrangement that had earned him suspicious looks from more traditional refugees. "The humans have offered to examine him," Zerk continued. "Not as a research subject, but as a patient. There's a difference." "You trust them?" Lyrale asked. Zerk's ears twitched in what might have been amusement. "I trust their arrogance. They're so convinced of their medical superiority that they actually take patient care seriously. It's quite endearing in a primitive sort of way." Despite her exhaustion, Lyrale found herself smiling. Zerk had always possessed a talent for finding humor in impossible situations. During the siege of New Thessaly, he'd insisted on telling jokes while treating wounded soldiers, claiming laughter was the best antiseptic. "Besides," Zerk added, "their diagnostic equipment is surprisingly sophisticated for a species that only discovered faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago. Sometimes fresh eyes see what familiar ones miss." Zephyr's cries intensified again, and Lyrale felt her resolve crumbling. She was a scientist, trained to follow evidence wherever it led. The evidence clearly indicated that Kitharan methods weren't helping her son. "Arrange it," she said finally. "But I want to be present for everything, no procedures without my consent." Zerk's ears perked up with satisfaction. "Already done. Dr. Ewan is expecting us in an hour." As they made their way through the camp toward the human medical facility, Lyrale noticed how the other species gave them a wide berth. Not from hostility, the peace accords had been signed, after all, but from a kind of awkward uncertainty that seemed to affect both sides equally. Humans and Kitharans shared meals, worked together on camp maintenance, even played crude translation games in the evenings, but there remained an invisible barrier that nobody quite knew how to cross. The medical bay smelled of antiseptic and ozone, familiar scents that reminded Lyrale of her own laboratory back on Kithara Prime. Dr. Ewan turned out to be a compact woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that moved with surgical precision. She examined Zephyr with professional detachment while the biopod's readings displayed on human monitors. "Interesting," Dr. Ewan murmured, studying the neural activity patterns. "Has he shown any response to specific stimuli? Certain sounds lights people. He seems more agitated around your soldiers," Lyrale admitted reluctantly. Dr. Ewan's eyebrows rose. "Military personnel specifically? That's unusual for an infant with no combat exposure." They ran tests for the next 2 hours. Scans that mapped Zephyr's developing neural pathways, analyses of his stress hormone levels, even experimental procedures that attempted to isolate whatever was triggering his distress. Nothing provided answers. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Ewan made a suggestion that surprised them both. "There's a new officer arriving tomorrow, Lieutenant Vasquez, part of the Reconciliation Corps. She specializes in interspecies cultural adaptation, maybe a fresh perspective." Lyrale felt her ears flatten against her skull. Another human, another expert with theories about her son. But as Zephyr's cries echoed through the medical bay, she realized she was running out of alternatives. Lieutenant Elena Vasquez had learned 3 important things during her first week on Epsilon 7. Kitharan coffee could strip paint from a starship hull. Human ration packs apparently tasted like processed despair, according to her translator. And organizing cultural exchange programs between former enemies was significantly more challenging than the academy training simulations had suggested. "No, no, no," she said for the 15th time that morning, watching a group of Kitharan children attempt to play what she'd optimistically called human baseball, using a graviton sphere and quantum-enhanced batting implements that belonged in a physics laboratory rather than a playground. The sphere was currently hovering 3 meters above the makeshift field, pulsing with rainbow energy while the children took turns swinging wildly at empty air. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Thex, whose ears were twitching in what Alina had learned was the Kitharan equivalent of barely suppressed laughter. This game requires different physics than we possess. Alina's handheld translator chose that moment to malfunction, rendering Thex's diplomatic comment as maybe this entertainment needs broken reality. She smacked the device against her palm, producing a shower of sparks and a string of increasingly creative mistranslations that made several nearby refugees' ears perk up with interest. "I think it's saying something about mating rituals now," whispered Private Henderson, the communications specialist who'd been assigned to help with the cultural programs. His own attempts at learning Kitharan had resulted in him accidentally proposing marriage to 3 different refugees, and somehow ordering lunch in what turned out to be ancient ceremonial battle language. "Turn it off," Alina sighed, watching the graviton sphere begin to orbit the camp perimeter while the children cheered. At least someone was having fun. Her mission briefing had made interspecies reconciliation sound straightforward. Facilitate cultural exchange, build understanding, demonstrate that humans and Kitharans could coexist peacefully. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that Kitharan humor relied heavily on electromagnetic field manipulation. Their children's games required equipment that violated several laws of physics, and their concept of fun often involved activities that would terrify most humans. Yesterday's cooking demonstration had been particularly memorable. Alina had attempted to show a group of Kitharan adults how to prepare traditional human pancakes, only to discover that their enhanced hearing made the sizzling oil sound like a plasma weapon discharge. 3 refugees had dove for cover, 2 had activated personal shield generators, and 1 elderly Kitharan had started reciting what her translator cheerfully identified as death preparation poetry. "Cultural barriers," Dr. Martinez had observed afterward, using his professional anthropologist voice while scraping burnt batter from the ceiling. "Fascinating, really. Their auditory sensitivity creates entirely different associations with common human activities." Alina had wanted to point out that "fascinating" wasn't the word she'd use for the incident, but Martinez was technically her superior officer and seemed to find academic value in her failures. This morning's theatrical experiment wasn't going much better. She'd suggested that some of the refugees might enjoy performing human literature, thinking that Shakespeare's universal themes would translate across species. The Kitharan volunteers had embraced the project with enthusiasm that should have been her first warning sign. "To be or not to be," declared Vexen, the camp's eldest refugee, his ears quivering with dramatic emphasis. "That is the... He paused, consulting his translation device. The fermented question. The other Kitharan actors nodded solemnly, apparently finding nothing unusual about Hamlet's existential crisis being reframed in terms of alcohol production. Alina's translator was now suggesting that slings and arrows of outrageous fortune should be rendered as flying sticks and pointy destiny, which honestly wasn't much worse than the professional translation she'd started with. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "we could try a different play, something simpler. Romeo and Juliet." Henderson called out, apparently forgetting that his last translation attempt had turned star-crossed lovers into astronomically confused reproducers. Alina was beginning to understand why the previous Reconciliation Corps officer had requested an emergency transfer to the Outer Rim. At least fighting space pirates was straightforward compared to explaining human culture to beings whose evolutionary development had taken entirely different paths. A commotion near the medical facility caught her attention. Through the camp's main thoroughfare, she could see a small crowd gathering around what appeared to be a heated discussion between human and Kitharan medical staff. Not unusual, debates about treatment protocols had become a daily occurrence as both species struggled to understand each other's physiology. "Want to check it out?" Henderson asked, following her gaze. "Might be more interesting than watching Hamlet debate the merits of fermentation." They made their way through the crowd, Alina's translator providing a running commentary of increasingly confused observations about the situation. According to the device, the discussion involved either small, loud entity causing distress waves or tiny acoustic weapon creating sadness radiation, neither of which sounded particularly reassuring. At the center of the crowd, a young Kitharan woman stood beside a biopod that was emanating the most heart-wrenching cries Alina had ever heard. The woman's ears were flattened against her skull in obvious distress, while Dr. Ewan gestured at holographic displays showing neural activity patterns that looked like abstract art. 3 weeks, Dr. Ewan was saying. No medical explanation. Normal physiology, optimal conditions, but the infant won't settle. Elena found herself drawn forward, past the ring of concerned observers. Something about the scene pulled at her in a way she couldn't quite explain. The crying wasn't just loud, it seemed to resonate at frequencies that made her bones ache with sympathetic vibration. "May I?" she asked, approaching the Kitharan woman. Her translator, apparently deciding to be helpful for once, rendered the question as permission to observe small suffering one. The woman's ears perked up slightly. "You are the new cultural officer," she said in careful English. "I am Lyrale. This is my son, Zephyr." Elena nodded, studying the biopod's readings. Her grandmother had been a pediatric nurse, and family dinners had often featured stories about difficult cases. Babies who couldn't sleep, mothers at their wits' end, mysterious conditions that defied explanation. But those had been human problems with human solutions. "Has he responded to any specific stimuli?" Elena asked, falling back on her grandmother's diagnostic approach. "Music, movement, different people." Lyrale's ears drooped. "He becomes more agitated around your soldiers. We thought it might be trauma response, but he has no conscious memories of the war." Elena frowned, studying the infant's face through the biopod's transparent aluminum. Zephyr was tiny even by human standards, his features delicate and unmistakably Kitharan, except for something indefinable around his eyes that seemed almost familiar. Without thinking, she reached toward the pod's access panel. The moment her hand approached the barrier, something extraordinary happened. Zephyr's cries didn't just diminish, they stopped completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was so profound that the surrounding crowd actually gasped. "What did you do?" Dr. Ewan asked, her professional composure cracking. Elena stared at her own hand, which was now pressed against the biopod's surface. Through the barrier, she could see Zephyr's eyes tracking her movement with an awareness that seemed impossible for an infant his age. When she moved her hand, his gaze followed. When she spoke, his ears perked up in mimicry of adult Kitharan attention responses. I don't know," Elena stammered. "I just—" The biopod's monitoring systems chimed softly, indicating that Zephyr's stress levels had dropped to normal ranges for the first time since his arrival. His breathing had settled into a peaceful rhythm, and the neural activity displays showed patterns associated with restful sleep. "Fascinating," Dr. Martinez appeared beside her, his anthropologist instincts fully engaged. "Cross-species empathic response. Pheromone compatible." The emergency call came at 3:47 hours, jolting Elena from the first decent sleep she'd managed since arriving on Epsilon 7. Her comm unit buzzed against the metal nightstand with the distinctive triple pulse that meant medical crisis, and she was pulling on her boots before her brain fully processed what was happening. "Vasquez here," she mumbled into the device, stumbling toward her shelter's door. "It's Dr. Ewan. We need you at the medical facility immediately. It's the Kitharan infant." Elena's stomach dropped. She'd spent the last 3 days trying to understand what had happened between her and Zephyr, submitting to every test Dr. Ewan and her team could devise. Neural scans, genetic analyses, electromagnetic field measurements. Nothing had provided answers, only more questions. Now, apparently, something had gone wrong. The camp looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, shadows cast by the artificial lighting systems making the prefabricated structures seem alien and temporary. A few early-rising refugees moved between the shelters, their elongated ears tracking sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. Elena nodded to them as she passed, her translator mercifully silent in sleep mode. At the medical facility, she found chaos barely contained within professional protocols. Dr. Ewan stood beside Zephyr's biopod, which was displaying warning indicators in angry red holographics. Lyrale paced nearby, her ears flattened against her skull in distress, while healer Zerk consulted with Dr. Martinez over a tablet showing neural activity patterns that looked like a seismic readout. "What's the situation?" Elena asked, approaching the biopod carefully. Even from a distance, she could hear Zephyr's cries, not just the normal infant distress she'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper and more anguished that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. "Started about an hour ago," Dr. Ewan explained, her professional calm cracking at the edges. "Elevated stress hormones, irregular neural firing, and his cries are registering at frequencies that shouldn't be possible for a Kitharan infant." The biopod's AI keeps suggesting conditions that don't exist in medical literature. Elena moved closer and immediately felt something she could only describe as psychic pressure, a weight against her thoughts that grew stronger with each step. Zephyr's cries seemed to harmonize with her own heartbeat, creating a resonance that made her teeth ache. "Has anyone tried?" she began, reaching toward the biopod. "Don't!" Dr. Martinez called out, looking up from his tablet. "We need to understand what's happening before we risk another episode." "Another episode?" Elena asked, her hand hovering inches from the pod's surface. Lyralay's ears perked up with desperate hope. "Yesterday, when you touched the pod, his neural activity synchronized with something. The computers detected quantum entanglement patterns at the subatomic level. It should be impossible, but the readings were undeniable." "Great," Elena muttered. "So I'm either having a psychic connection with an alien baby, or I'm accidentally quantum entangling myself with infant brain waves. Both options sound completely normal and not at all terrifying." Henderson chose that moment to arrive, carrying what appeared to be an improvised coffee service and wearing the expression of someone who'd given up trying to understand his assignment. "Morning, everyone. I brought caffeine, which seemed more useful than my translation skills. Anyone want to explain why half the camp is awake and the other half is hiding in their shelters with noise-dampening fields?" Zephyr's cries are apparently triggering some kind of empathic response in other Kitharans, Dr. Ewan explained. "Nothing dangerous, but uncomfortable enough that they're seeking acoustic isolation." "And the human response?" Elena asked, noting that several staff members looked distinctly unsettled. "Headaches mostly," Dr. Martinez replied. "Some mild disorientation. You're the only one who seems completely unaffected." Elena stared at the biopod, where Zephyr's tiny fists pressed against the transparent barrier. His eyes, when they met hers through the material, held an awareness that seemed impossible for someone his age. There was something almost familiar about his gaze, as if she were looking at a reflection of something she couldn't quite identify. "What if," she said slowly, "this isn't about me affecting him? What if he's trying to communicate?" The medical staff exchanged glances that suggested they'd already considered this possibility and found it disturbing. Lyralay stepped forward, her ears angled with desperate attention. "Communicate what?" she asked. Elena approached the biopod despite Dr. Martinez's protests, her hand moving toward the surface. The moment her palm made contact, the change was immediate and profound. Zephyr's cries stopped, but instead of the peaceful silence from before, Elena felt something like presence. Not thoughts exactly, but emotions and sensations that definitely weren't her own. Fear, confusion, an overwhelming sense of displacement that went beyond physical location. And underneath it all, something that felt like recognition, as if Zephyr had been searching for her specifically. "Oh," Elena breathed, her eyes widening. "Oh, that's not normal. What are you experiencing?" Dr. Ewan asked, medical scanners already tracking Elena's vital signs. "He's scared," Elena said, her voice distant. "Not of anything specific, just existing. Like he doesn't understand why he's here or where here even is. And there's something else." She paused, trying to process the flood of alien sensations. Through the connection, she could feel Zephyr's confusion about his own body, his frustration with sensory input that didn't match some internal template. It was as if he expected to perceive the world differently than his Kitharan physiology allowed. "This is going to sound insane," Elena continued, "but I think he's experiencing some kind of species dysphoria. Like his consciousness doesn't match his biology." Dr. Martinez nearly dropped his tablet. That would require self-awareness levels far beyond infant cognitive development. Are you suggesting he remembers being human?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Elena replied, though she could feel Zephyr's emotions settling as the connection stabilized. "I'm just reporting what I'm experiencing, and what I'm experiencing is a baby who seems surprised to have pointed ears and enhanced hearing." Healer Zerk had been unusually quiet during the exchange, but now he stepped forward with an expression Elena couldn't read. "There are old stories," he said carefully, "from before our species made contact. Legends about souls that become lost between the stars and find their way into the wrong bodies." "Oh, come on," Henderson interjected, apparently deciding that someone needed to voice the skepticism everyone was feeling. "We're talking about reincarnation now. What's next? Alien ghosts? Interdimensional soul swapping?" Dr. Ewan was studying her scanner readings, with the intensity of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. Alina's neural activity is showing patterns consistent with shared consciousness experiences, and the quantum entanglement signatures are getting stronger. Through the biopod, Zephyr had settled into the most peaceful sleep he'd achieved since his arrival on Epsilon 7. His tiny hand was pressed against the barrier directly opposite Alina's palm, and she could swear she felt warmth through the material despite knowing it was designed to be thermally neutral. "So what do we do?" Lyreley asked, her ears betraying a mixture of hope and terror. "If my son is somehow connected to Lieutenant Vasquez, what does that mean for his development, for both of them?" "It means, Doctor," Ewan said grimly, "that we're in completely uncharted territory, and it means that certain people are going to be very interested in studying this phenomenon." Alina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the medical facility's climate control. She'd joined the Reconciliation Corps to build bridges between species, not to become some kind of interspecies laboratory specimen. But as she looked down at Zephyr's peaceful face, she realized that walking away wasn't an option. Whatever was happening between them, the infant needed her in ways that defied scientific explanation. "Well," she said with forced lightness, "at least my cultural exchange programs are going to be more interesting than Shakespeare now." Outside, the first artificial dawn was beginning to cycle through the camp's lighting systems, and Alina could hear the sounds of refugees beginning their daily routines. None of them knew that everything was about to change, that the crying infant who had kept them awake for weeks had just demonstrated a connection that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the boundaries between species. But they would learn soon enough. 3 months after the first connection, Epsilon 7 had transformed from a refugee camp into something unprecedented. A research station, diplomatic outpost, and accidental pilgrimage site all rolled into one chaotic package. Alina stood in what used to be the recreation center, now converted into a laboratory that looked like someone had crossed a nursery with a quantum physics experiment, watching Dr. Sarah Audiobook attempt to explain xenopsychology to a room full of scientists who kept interrupting each other in 4 different languages. "The neural bridging effect," Dr. Audiobook was saying, gesturing at holographic brain scans that rotated lazily above the conference table, "appears to be triggered by specific genetic markers in Lieutenant Vasquez, combined with unusual telepathic sensitivity in the infant subject." "Subject," Alina muttered under her breath. "His name is Zephyr." Henderson, who had somehow become her unofficial assistant in managing the circus that their lives had become, handed her a cup of what passed for coffee on Epsilon 7. "At least they stopped calling him the anomaly," he pointed out. "Remember last week when that Kitharan scientist kept referring to him as the consciousness displacement phenomenon?" Alina grimaced at the memory. Dr. Velter had meant well, but his clinical approach to Zephyr's condition had nearly caused a diplomatic incident when Lyreley overheard him discussing harvesting neural tissue for analysis. It had taken 3 hours, and Henderson's accidentally hilarious mistranslation of research ethics as study morality dancing to calm everyone down. "The real question," Dr. Audiobook continued, apparently oblivious to the sidebar conversations, "is whether we're looking at a unique occurrence or the emergence of a new evolutionary development in human-Kitharan interaction." That was the part that kept Alina awake at night. In the weeks since Zephyr's breakthrough, 3 other mixed-species pairings had reported unusual connections, nothing as dramatic as her bond with the infant, but enough to suggest that something fundamental was changing in how their species related to each other. A commotion outside the conference room caught her attention. Through the reinforced windows, she could see a crowd gathering around the main entrance to the research facility. At the center of the disturbance, a group of Kitharan protesters held signs with slogans that her translator was rendering as "Protect Genetic Purity" and "Stop Contamination Experiments," though Henderson insisted they actually said something about keeping soul flavors separate. "Separatists," Dr. Martinez observed grimly. "They've been getting more organized." Alina's jaw tightened. The extremist group had arrived 2 weeks ago, claiming that Zephyr represented some kind of human contamination of Kitharan genetics. Their leader, a stern-faced Kitharan named Kexval, had demanded that the infant be removed from Alina's influence and raised in traditional isolation to prevent further neural corruption. "They can protest all they want," Alina said firmly. Zephyr stays with his mother and I stay involved in his care. End of discussion. Her protective instincts had surprised everyone, including herself. 6 months ago, she'd been a career officer focused on advancing through the Reconciliation Corps ranks. Now, she found herself willing to face down interstellar political pressure to protect an alien infant who had somehow become central to her existence. Dr. Ewan appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing exhaustion with barely contained excitement. "Elena, we need you in the medical bay, now." They rushed through the facility's corridors, past laboratories filled with equipment that definitely hadn't been designed for studying infant telepathy. The medical bay itself had expanded to 3 times its original size, with monitoring stations that tracked everything from quantum field fluctuations to what Dr. Ockafer insisted on calling empathic resonance patterns. Zephyr lay in his biopod, which had been upgraded with sensors that made it look more like a spaceship control panel than a baby's crib. At 6 months old, he was developing at a rate that concerned both human and Kitharan pediatric specialists, not physically, but cognitively. His awareness levels were off the charts for his age, and his ability to communicate through their neural link was becoming increasingly sophisticated. "Show her, Doctor," Ewan said to Lyreley, who stood beside the pod with an expression that mixed pride and terror. Lyreley placed her hand on the biopod's surface, and immediately every monitoring device in the room began displaying synchronized patterns. Elena approached cautiously, her own palm finding its familiar position opposite Zephyr's tiny hand. The moment contact was established, she felt the now familiar rush of shared consciousness, but this time something was different. Instead of the confused emotions and fragmented sensations she'd grown accustomed to, Elena found herself experiencing something that felt remarkably like coherent thought. Not words exactly, but concepts and ideas that were definitely too complex for a 6-month-old infant. "Hello, Elena," came a presence that was unmistakably Zephyr, though the communication bypassed language entirely. "I've been practicing." Elena nearly stumbled backward in shock. "Did he just—" "I did." Zephyr's mental voice continued, tinged with what felt like amusement. "Took me a while to figure out how to make the thoughts go where I wanted them to go." "This is impossible," Dr. Martinez breathed, staring at the neural activity displays. "Telepathic communication requires cognitive development that shouldn't emerge until—" "Until when?" Zephyr interrupted, somehow managing to project curiosity directly into Elena's mind. "I'm confused about a lot of things, but thinking isn't one of them." Elena found herself laughing despite the surreal situation. "Zephyr, can you remember being human?" A pause filled with what felt like careful consideration. "I remember being different, having different ears, different hearing, being taller." Another pause, "being you." The words hit Elena like a plasma discharge. Around the medical bay, every piece of monitoring equipment began displaying readings that Dr. Ewan would later describe as completely unprecedented in xenopsychological literature. "I think," Zephyr continued with the patience of someone much older than 6 months, "I used to be human. And I think I used to be you, or part of you. It's confusing." Henderson, who had been silently documenting everything with his recording equipment, finally spoke up. "So we're dealing with, what? Reincarnation, soul transfer, really exotic twins." "I prefer consciousness recycling," Zephyr projected with unmistakable humor. "It sounds more scientific." Despite everything, the political pressure, the scientific impossibility, the fact that she was having a telepathic conversation with an infant, Elena found herself grinning. Whatever Zephyr was, he had definitely inherited her sense of humor. The moment was interrupted by alarms throughout the facility. Through the windows, Elena could see the Kitharan separatists pushing past security barriers, their leader shouting something that her translator was rendering as "Stop the contamination experiments." "They're trying to reach the medical bay," Dr. Ewan said grimly, activating emergency protocols that sealed the facility's internal doors. Elena felt Zephyr's distress spike through their connection, his infant emotions reacting to the adult crisis surrounding him. Without thinking, she pressed both hands against the biopod and projected every calming thought she could manage. What happened next would be studied by xenopsychologists for decades. The neural link between Elena and Zephyr suddenly expanded, creating a resonance field that encompassed every human and Kitharan within a kilometer radius. For exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, the boundaries between individual consciousness became permeable. The separatist protesters suddenly felt Lyralei's desperate love for her son. The human security guards experienced the deep cultural grief that drove Kitharan fears of contamination. Elena found herself flooded with the memories and emotions of dozens of individuals, while simultaneously feeling her own thoughts and feelings spreading outward like ripples in a vast pond. When the effect finally faded, the camp had gone completely silent. Elena opened her eyes to find herself surrounded by humans and Kitharans who were staring at each other with expressions of profound recognition. Outside, the protesters had stopped shouting and were embracing the security guards they'd been fighting moments before. "Sorry," Zephyr projected sheepishly. "I didn't mean to do that to everyone. I was just scared." Dr. Ockhaffer was the first to speak, her voice filled with wonder. "Did we just experience mass empathy? The readings suggest a temporary neural network encompassing multiple consciousness, Doctor." Ewan added, studying her scanners with shaking hands. Every individual in range became briefly connected to every other individual. Healer Zerk stepped forward, his ears angled with something that might have been reverence. The old story spoke of this, the great joining when all minds would touch and understanding would replace fear. Henderson looked around at the mixed groups of humans and Kitharans who were still talking quietly among themselves, sharing experiences and comparing memories from the brief connection. "Well," he said finally, "this is either going to solve interspecies relations forever or make them infinitely more complicated." Elena looked down at Zephyr, who was regarding her with eyes that held far too much awareness for an infant. Through their link, she could feel his contentment, his sense of belonging, and something else, a quiet determination that reminded